So far, Kant has shown us 4 ways in which reason comes into contradiction with itself. Maybe 5 ways if we take the space-time distinction in the first conflict seriously. So there are 5 ways in which reason comes into conflict with itself. And now what Kant is going to do, starting from section 3 and basically up to section 7, is he is going to explain to us why that happens, what the root cause of that is, and how to solve it, how to deal with this. And it's going to turn out that, well, no surprise, the only way to solve it is through transcendental idealism, and Kant is actually going to present that as a sort of extra argument in favor of transcendental idealism, because only transcendental idealism can escape from these conflicts of reason, which otherwise would, well, I guess, like, make a lot of trouble for reason, and in fact maybe destroy our very ability to trust reason. Right? So transcendental idealism is going to come onto the stage here as a savior. So when Sebastian Gardner, in his guidebook to Kant and a Critique of Pure Reason, comes to talk about these parts of the Antinomy, and this is on page 245, he says this: sections 3 to 7 of the Antinomy comprise the climax of the dialectic, as well as being one of the most beautiful and profound stretches of argument in Kant's writings. So it's not only the climax of the dialectic, it's also one of the most beautiful and profound stretches of argument in Kant's writings. Okay, well, these are definitely some good parts of the book. And I would say the reason that in general, when people delve into the dialectic, they tend to spend most time on the antinomy, more than on the paralogisms or the ideal. And what's happening here definitely has something to do with that. Okay, so let's see what happens in these sections 3 to 7. So in the third section, on the interest of reason in these conflicts, Kant is going to put forward something that he has hinted at before and is going to say more about later on, but that is actually very important to him. The idea that there are interests at work, that reason, and in a sense different parts of reason, or if you want different applications of reason, have different interests. And so when we think about things like, well, is the world eternal or not? Right? Should we assume a beginning of time or not? Should we assume that there is freedom or not? Well, there are different interests at work here. There are different goals. With all of these questions, with all of these answers, really, we can ask, well, what do we gain? Right? What would be the good for us if we were to embrace this answer? If we were to think about things in this way? And so that is what Kant is going to investigate. Now, he points out that and of course we've already seen that in all of these conflicts of reason with itself, sort of the theses belong in the same category and the antitheses belong in the same category. The theses belong in the same category because all of them posit an end point to the chain of regression, right? Something that is the first moment of time, that is the limit of the world in space. That is the free cause, the self-caused cause that doesn't point beyond a further cause, that is the simple part of matter that can't be subdivided, or that is the necessary thing that doesn't require something else for its existence. On the other hand, the antithesis always says, no, nothing like that can be found. There is just an infinite chain of regressions, right? That's the only thing that we can find. That's what we have to posit, an infinite chain of regressions. So here is what Kant tells us about the dogmatism, like the claim that we know something, in a sense, of the theses, right? And he puts this over and against the empiricism of the antithesis, which basically says, no, nothing like that can be found in experience. We don't find the first moment of time. We don't find the simple. And so it's the antithesis that seem to reject these ideas like a beginning of time and a free cause and so on and so forth, because they can never be encountered in experience, right? And that's why Kant calls this empiricism. So, when we come to dogmatism, and now at A466, there is, Kant says, a practical interest. There's a practical interest because all these things are cornerstones of morality and religion, right? Believing that there is a first moment of time, well, that's an important part of religion, because that sort of involves the idea that God has made this world as it is now with a purpose. Believing that there is freedom, believing that there is a necessary being, right? You can see how these fit into a sort of traditional story about morality and religion. So there's a clear practical interest here, Kant says. Practical in the sense of having to do with action, having to do with what we do. Morality and religion are all about what we do and what we may hope. And so the theses have a clear practical interest. They also have a speculative interest of reason, for if one assumes it employs the transcendental ideas in such a way, then one can grasp the whole chain of conditions fully a priori and comprehend the derivation of the conditioned, starting with the unconditioned. So it's kind of nice, right? It seems to make sense of the world to posit these things, because it gives you this finished story. Oh, we have the unconditioned, it's here, and ta-da, that sort of explains everything. Finally, thirdly, all the theses have the merit of popularity. The common understanding does not find the least difficulty in the idea of an unconditioned beginning for every synthesis. Well, the common understanding might not really know what an unconditioned beginning for every synthesis is, but it doesn't find the least difficulty, Kant would say, in the idea that the world was created in time, that the world is limited in space, that we are free, that there is a God, or at least a necessary being, and so on and so forth. So, there's that. On the other hand, when we go to empiricism, Kant says, of the antitheses, there is no practical interest there at all. Right? None of the antitheses make any positive contribution to morality, for instance. Right? If I tell you that you are not free, okay. If I tell you that there is no necessary being, everything is just contingent, okay. That's not gonna push you towards the kind of worldview that at least Kant believes is relevant for a religious attitude or a moral attitude. On the contrary, however, Kant goes on, empiricism offers advantages to the speculative interests of reason, which are very attractive and far surpass any that the dogmatic teacher of the ideas of reason might promise. For with empiricism, the understanding is at every time on its own proper ground, namely the field solely of possible experiences, whose laws it traces and by means of which it can endlessly extend its secure and comprehensible cognition. Right? The empiricist is, well, an empiricist. So if we are after empirical knowledge, if we have a heart for the sciences and so on and so forth, then the empiricist way of thinking sounds a lot better than the dogmatic way of thinking, which tends, Kant is going to tell us, which tends to sort of just posit, oh, well, that's because of God. Well, that's, that's where the chain of explanation ends. And it sort of dogmatically posits a beginning that doesn't require any further explanation against the spirit of scientific thinking. So empiricism is, in a sense, if we think of this theoretically, the better thing. Maybe not the truer thing, but the better thing in the sense that it allows us to pursue our legitimate theoretical investigations further than dogmatism does. So, that is sort of what Kant is doing here in this third section. And okay, he goes on to say that the empiricist does most of the time make a further move which he shouldn't do, and through which theoretical cognition, theoretical reasoning might actually be harmed. So here we are at A470, and Kant tells us that if the empirical philosopher with his antithesis had no other intention than to strike down the impertinent curiosity and presumptuousness of those who so far mistake the true vocation of reason that they make most of insight and knowledge just where insight and knowledge really cease, trying to pass off what one should base on practical interests as furthering speculative interests, blah, 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 blah. Well, if he only wanted to do that, if the antithesis was only there to refute the thesis, if the empiricists were just to say, no, no, we can't know that there's a beginning in time, he would be Kant's greatest friend. In fact, he would be Kant. But that is not what the empiricist generally does, at least not the kind of empiricist that Kant is thinking of, because that kind of empiricist goes on to say, no, no, the world has no beginning in time. And that is, of course, to claim a kind of knowledge that one doesn't actually have. Now, this distinction between the speculative and the practical interest is important for Kant, and what we just heard Kant say is that the dogmatist is trying to pass off what one should base on practical interests as furthering speculative interests. Right? And this is going to be part of Kant's basic story, which is that, yes, we need to believe in freedom, and we need to believe in God, and we need to believe in immortality, but only because of our practical interests. And to claim that we know this in some theoretical sense, that we have well-founded knowledge of this, that is wrong, and that in fact does harm to the theoretical interests of reason. And that is why in the critique of pure reason, which is actually the critique of theoretical pure reason, pure theoretical reason, Kant is going to end up claiming that we do not know and emphasizing that we do not know answers to any of these questions, that we do not know whether there is a God, whether there is freedom, and so on and so forth. About the beginning in time, he's going to be a little bit more explicit. He's going to tell us a little bit further on, in fact very soon, that we know that there is no beginning in time, and also that there is, well, what we know is that it's false that there is a beginning in time. That's how I should phrase this. We know that it is false that there is a beginning in time, although we also know that it's false that there is no beginning in time. Neither of these can be asserted. Okay, that's what we'll get to in a second. Just want to point out that at the very end of this third section, Kant, not for the last time I believe, Kant gives a very brief indication that he is in favor of freedom of speech. Right? So he tells us that mere honesty requires that a reflective and inquiring being should devote certain times solely to testing its own reason, withdrawing entirely from all partiality and publicly communicating its remarks to others for their judgment. No one can be reproached for, still less restrained from, letting the propositions and counter-propositions, terrorized by no threats, come forward to defend themselves before a jury drawn from their own estate, namely the estate of fallible human beings. So what Kant is absolutely definitely saying here is that whatever ideas you have in metaphysics, bring them forward, we're gonna discuss them, and nobody is allowed to bring in something outside of the estate of fallible human beings to silence you. Well, what would that be? That would be religious authority, right? Nobody should be allowed to use religious authority to silence your metaphysical speculations. Kant is actually a great defender of free speech. So, that brings us to section 4, the transcendental problems of pure reason, insofar as they absolutely must be capable of a solution. Okay, insofar as they absolutely must be capable of a solution. I'm going to read a little passage at A477. Now, I assert that among all speculative cognition, transcendental philosophy has the special property that there is no question at all dealing with an object given by pure reason that is insoluble by this very same human reason, and that no plea of unavoidable ignorance and the unfathomable depth of the problem can release us from the obligation of answering it thoroughly and completely. For the very same concept that puts us in a position to ask the question must also make us competent to answer it, since the object is not encountered at all outside the concept. So what Kant is saying here is that we cannot plead ignorance in the realm of transcendental philosophy, right? Because, for instance, here we are dealing with these ideas of reason. They are our ideas, right? Nothing in experience is going to answer to them, right? It's not, I mean, if I ask you the question how many tables there are in my house, Okay, well, you know, my house and table, those are things that you can encounter and experience, and you're going to need experience that you'll probably never have in order to answer that question. That can't be the case when I ask whether the world is eternal. I mean, the world is an idea of reason. I've got to be able to answer that question either by saying yes, it's eternal, or by saying no, it's not eternal, or by saying something else which explains to me why the question cannot be answered with a simple yes or no. So, there must be an answer, and reason must be competent to find it. That is also the case if there is no yes, no answer, right, as I just indicated. So around the beginning of A482, Kant tells us that if we cannot say or settle anything certain about these questions on the basis of our own concepts, then we must not pass the blame on to the subject matter, because there is no subject matter, right? No thing that we need to encounter. We must seek the cause in our idea itself as a problem permitting of no solution, about which, however, we stubbornly insist on an actual object corresponding to it. Right? The problem is going to be that we have an idea that we actually cannot ask certain questions about, and yet we stubbornly insist on thinking that an object corresponds to it. In particular, we are stubbornly insisting on the idea that there is something called the world that we can ask these questions about, and that is what Kant is going to make problems for. So at the very end of section 4 he says this: since therefore the solution to these problems can never occur in experience, you cannot say that it is uncertain what is to be ascribed to the object regarding them, for your object is merely in your brain and cannot be given at all outside it. Hence all you have to worry about is agreeing with yourself and avoiding the amphiboly that would make your idea into a putative representation of something given empirically, and thus of an object to be cognized in accordance with the laws of experience. Thus, the dogmatic solution is not merely uncertain, but impossible. The critical solution, however, which can be completely certain, does not consider the question objectively at all, but instead asks about the foundations of the cognition in which it is grounded. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Ask about the cognitions. What do we think of? What do these questions, what kind of questions are these? Let us embark on a transcendental investigation of these very questions themselves. In section 5, Kant is going to engage in a little bit of skepticism. Not skepticism as a body of negative doctrines, like we don't know this, we don't know that, we don't know such and so, but skepticism as a method for sort of dissolving fake problems. Okay, so we want to know something about this cosmological idea about the world. At A486, Kant writes this: if I could antecedently see about a cosmological idea that whatever side of the unconditioned in the regressive synthesis of appearances it might come down on, it would be either too big or too small for every concept of the understanding, then I would comprehend that since it has to do with an object of experience, which should conform to a possible concept of the understanding, this idea must be entirely empty and without significance. So what Kant is going to do here is he's going to indicate for all of these problems that they are either too small or too large for concepts of the understanding, and so no object could ever correspond to it. So if we take the question whether the world has a beginning, well, if it has no beginning, it is too big for my concept. For this concept, which consists in a successive regress, can never reach the whole eternity that has elapsed. Right? No matter how often the understanding takes this idea of a previous time and a previous time and a previous time, it's never gonna take in this whole. So, on the other hand, if we think of the world as having a beginning in time, then also the understanding is not going to fit the concept, because the understanding wants to take further steps beyond the point where our claim, the claim that the world has a beginning in time, doesn't allow it to go. So if we think about the concept of the understanding, well, you know, they have this structure of always allowing for one further step. right? And the fact that they always allow for a further step means that no limited whole can ever correspond to them. But the fact that they always allow for a further step, right, something which has to be taken in synthesis, like another step and another step and another step, means that no completed whole can ever correspond to it either. So both the thesis and the antithesis can antecedently be known to never fit the concepts of the understanding. So there can never be an object that corresponds to them. Right? This is something that we can know in advance, that the idea of the world, that is the central idea in the question of whether, or the idea of nature, but the idea of the world, that is the central concept in the question whether the world is or is not eternal, cannot even be grasped by the understanding. Right? It's just nothing, no object given to the understanding, no object comprehensible to the understanding, can be this world. Okay, well that means that, you know, according to transcendental idealism, we're in trouble. As Kant points out at A489, where he says, okay, by the way, I said that this concept of reason never fits the concept of the understanding. Why didn't I say it the other way around? Right? Why don't I blame the understanding for being unable to fit the concepts of reason? Well, the point is, says Kant, that reason, that it's possible experience alone that can give our concepts reality. Hence, the possible empirical concept was the standard by which it had to be judged whether the idea is a mere idea and a thought entity, or instead encounters its object within the world. Right? It's the understanding that sets the standard for reason. At least here, at least in this sense. Right? If we want to know whether these ideas of reason correspond to a real object, well, the understanding is the arbiter, and the understanding says no. Right? The world is not the kind of object that the categories of the understanding can ever generate for us. Section 6. Transcendental idealism as the key to solving the cosmological ideas. Well, Kant tells us first, once again, what he means by transcendental idealism, and that, you know, it thinks of space and time as not being things in themselves. He tells us a bit about, you know, why, for instance, we would say that inhabitants of the moon would be, like, real, could exist. It's not because we've perceived them, but because there is, like, sort of an empirical law taking us from our perception to them. Okay. What about the world? Right? Again, this central idea of this cosmological idea of the world as the totality of all events. Well, Kant is going to say, like, there's no way to get from your perception using this empirical synthesis that takes you further and further and further to the totality. So here, let's read at A495. The real things of past time are given in the transcendental object of experience. But for me they are objects and real in past time only insofar as I represent to myself that, in accordance with empirical laws, or in other words, the course of the world, a regressive series of possible perceptions leads to a time series that has elapsed as the condition of the present time, which is then presented as real only in connection with a possible experience and not in itself. So what Kant is telling us, that something is a real thing in time for me, in past time. Something is a real past object for me only if, following the empirical laws, or the course of the world, as we might also call it, we can represent it as, you know, being this condition from which, after a while, the present, the stuff I perceive, has evolved. To be something in the past is to be something from which the present conditions can be seen, or at least thought, to have evolved. So a little bit later on, Kant says this: if accordingly I represent altogether all existing objects of sense in all time and all spaces, I do not posit them as being there in space and time prior to experience, but rather this representation is nothing other than the thought of a possible experience in its absolute completeness. In it alone are those objects given. So when we think about the world, Kant is telling us, I shouldn't think of it as, this pre-existing, like independent of me, collection of objects spread out in space and time. What I'm thinking when I'm thinking the world is I am thinking the thought of this empirical synthesis, which goes out forever and forever and forever, and now I'm sort of thinking it as the completed, like the end of that. And of course, it's a process that has no end. So at the very end of section 6, Kant says, only in another relation, when these same appearances are to be used on behalf of the cosmological idea of an absolute whole, and having to do with a question that goes beyond the bounds of possible experience, is it important to distinguish between the ways one might take the reality of objects of sense when thinking them, so as to prevent a deceptive delusion that must inevitably arise if we misinterpret our own concepts of experience. If I am like a natural scientist and I'm wondering, where did this pen come from? Maybe this is more a sociologist or an economist. Where did this pencil come from? And I trace it back to a pencil factory. It doesn't really matter whether I'm aware of the distinction between appearances and things in themselves. Right? I mean, that is really pretty irrelevant. I don't really need the critique of pure reason when I'm just doing some limited empirical research. But when I start asking questions about the world as a whole, then it becomes important, right? When I, as Kant said, when I think of this cosmological idea of an absolute whole, then the transcendental distinction between a thing in itself and an appearance is going to be very, very important indeed. So, section 7, the sort of conclusion of the argument that we've been following, the critical decision of the cosmological conflict of reason with itself, this is where Kant is going to solve it, right? This is where Kant is going to tell us how we should deal with it. The ingredients, I guess, are clear. Okay, first, Kant says, this is B526, it's approximately where A498 starts. First, the following proposition is clear and undoubtedly certain. If the conditioned is given, then through it a regress in the series of all conditions for it is given to us as a problem. As a problem. What does that mean? If this is given, then it is given to me as a problem for empirical thinking. What was its cause? And what was the cause of that? And what was the cause of that? And what was the cause of that? And ... Right? This is given to me as a problem. And if I have sort of unlimited research capacity, I can follow this problem forever. And of course, everything posits me a problem like that. Just like space and time do. What happened before that? And before that? And before that? What happens a little bit further on and a little bit further on? There's no limits. Right? Anything that's given to me in experience posits the problem of, bam, going beyond all those limits of my knowledge, expanding my knowledge again and again. This is unproblematic, says Kant. We ought to continue it as far as possible. Further, if the conditioned as well as its conditions are things in themselves, then when the first is given, not only is the regress to the second given as a problem, but the latter is thereby really already given along with it. Right? If there is a thing in itself, something that is independent of the way that I sense it, that I think of it, it's just, its own thing. If it has conditions, then those conditions must be just as real as the thing itself, right? If a thing in itself is, requires for its existence something else, then that something else must exist too. And if that requires for its existence something else, then that must exist too. And this either into a limited point where we find something that doesn't require something else, or like all the way into the unlimited. One of those two things has to be the case, right? If we think about things in themselves, then either there must be a limited chain of conditions or there must be an unlimited chain of conditions, but one of these two things has to be true. And so, if, for instance, space and time are things in themselves, and the objects in space and time are things in themselves, then there must be a truth about the world either having a beginning in time or not having a beginning in time. Right? It can't be otherwise. One of these things must be true, the other must be false. That is what Kant is telling us here. But, of course, the crucial assumption is that we are talking about things in themselves. Right? Things which exist independently of somebody like me actually going through this process, or at least being able of going through this process of synthesis. On the contrary, Kant says, and this is B527, just before A499, on the contrary, if I am dealing with appearances, which as mere representations are not given at all if I do not achieve acquaintance with them, that is, to them themselves, for they are nothing except empirical cognitions, then I cannot say with the same meaning that if the conditioned is given, then all the conditions for it are also given, and hence I can by no means infer the absolute totality of the series of these conditions. For the appearances are themselves nothing other than an empirical synthesis, and thus are given only in this synthesis. Right? So, appearances are, they are intrinsically related to our cognition. And our cognition posits to us as a problem, like always taking this synthesis a step further, and it tells us that we ought to be able to do that, and even that we ought to try to do it. But of course it doesn't posit that we have already done that, or that anyone else has already done that, or that there is some intellect, exactly like us except infinite, that has already done that. Right? There is no absolute totality posited when we posit an appearance. That is, there is only a potential totality posited, right? I mean, we can always go a bit further. There's a potential infinity here, but there is no actual infinity here. That's the way that we could phrase that too. From this, it is clear, this is almost at B528, A500. From this it is clear that the major premise of the cosmological syllogism takes the conditioned in the transcendental signification of a pure category, while the minor premise takes it in the empirical signification of a concept of the understanding applied to mere appearances. So what is going on, Kant says, is that, we start by saying, this entire chain of conditions must be given, so the unconditioned must be given whenever the conditioned is given. Well, that's true for things in themselves. The appearances are given as conditioned, that's true, but those are not things in themselves, and so we can't put them together and claim that when an appearance is given, the unconditioned is given too. That is what goes wrong. So, this is hard to understand, Kant tells us. At A501, he says, nothing seems clearer than that between the two, one of whom asserts that the world has a beginning, and the other that it has no beginning, but has existed from eternity, one of them has to be right. Right? If somebody says the world is eternal, and somebody says the world is not eternal, it seems clear that either the first is right or the second is right. Maybe, you could think, maybe Kant's transcendental idealism is going to say, we can't know who is right. But that is not what he wants to say at all. He wants to say that both are wrong. How could both be wrong? Well, if somebody says that the world is eternal, somebody else says that the world is not eternal, what they are both assuming is that the concept of eternity applies to the world. Right? That it makes sense to ask the question whether the world is eternal. At A502, B530, Kant suddenly brings in Zeno, right? The ancient Greek philosopher, the pre-Socratic Zeno, who, claimed things that God is neither finite nor infinite, that the world is neither in motion nor at rest, and people would think, this is crazy. right? Either the world is in motion or it is at rest. Either God is finite or God is infinite. No, says Kant. No, he was actually quite right to say this. If by the word God he understood the universe, then he must of course say that neither is it persistingly present in its place, at rest, nor does it alter its place, move, because all places are only in the universe. Hence the universe itself is in no place. And so on and so forth, right? If you claim that the world is moving, you are not saying something that could be true or that could be false. You are illegitimately applying the word moving to something to which it cannot be applied, the world. Something very much like this is going on in the cosmological, in the antinomy. Let's read on. Near the beginning of A504. Just a moment. So, around the beginning of A504, Kant says this. Accordingly, if I say that as regards space, either the world is infinite or it is not infinite, then if the first proposition is false, its contradictory opposite, the world is not infinite, must be true. Through it, I would rule out only an infinite world without positing another one, namely a finite one. But if it is said that the world is either infinite or finite, not infinite, then both propositions could be false. For then I regard the world as determined in itself regarding its magnitude. So here what Kant is saying is that, suppose that you cannot say that the world is finite, right? That the world is not finite. Then you can say, according to him, that the world is not finite. You can't say that the world is infinite, right? You can say that it's not the case that the world is finite, but you shouldn't say that it is the case that the world is not finite. That kind of thing. Now, I suspect that a lot of modern day logicians would like to say that, you know, maybe there's something else going on here, right? Maybe a claim like the world is infinite or the world is finite turns out to be meaningless, so that you also cannot state its opposite. But, you know, I think it's clear what Kant is meaning to tell us, right? What he's meaning to tell us that it would be false to say that the world is infinite, that it's false to say that the world is finite, maybe in our parlance that it is meaningless to say either of these two things. But definitely that we shouldn't say either of those two things, because ascribing finitude or infinitude to the world is based on a presupposition that is false, namely the presupposition that the world is determined in itself regarding its magnitude, which it is not. So, Kant goes on. If one regards the two propositions, the world is infinite in magnitude and the world is finite in magnitude, as contradictory opposites, then one assumes that the world, the whole series of appearances, is a thing in itself. For the world remains even though I may rule out the infinite or finite regress in the series of its appearances. But if I take away this presupposition, or rather this transcendental illusion, and deny that it is a thing in itself, then the contradictory conflict of the two assertions is transformed into a merely dialectical conflict. And because the world does not exist at all, independently of the regressive series of my representations, it exists neither as an in itself infinite whole, nor as an in itself finite whole. And so, how do we solve the antinomy? How do we solve these conflicts of reason? We solve them by showing that if we accept transcendental idealism, once we realize that this absolute whole is only an idea of reason that is sort of the fictional endpoint of a synthesis that the understanding has to make, then we understand that it's not something that's already there, and of which we can sensibly ask, is it finite, is it infinite, is it like this, is it like that? No such thing, in a sense, exists. It certainly doesn't exist in the sense that we can ask these kinds of questions about it. And so, and here we come to the almost the very end of this paragraph, at A506. Accordingly, the antinomy of pure reason in its cosmological ideas is removed by showing that it is merely dialectical, and a conflict due to an illusion arising from the fact that one has applied the idea of absolute totality, which is valid only as a condition of things in themselves, to appearances that exist only in representation. Is that useless? No, it's very useful, because it has proven indirectly the transcendental ideality of appearances. If perhaps someone did not have enough in the direct proof in transcendental aesthetic. Right, so Kant very explicitly tells us that, okay, we've proved this in the transcendental aesthetic, but here's another proof. The proof would consist in this dilemma. If the world is a whole existing in itself, then it is either finite or infinite. Now the first as well as the second alternative is false, thus it is also false that the world is a whole existing in itself, from which it follows that appearances in general are nothing outside our representations, which is just what we mean by their transcendental ideality. Okay, that's what I want to say about the sections 3 to 7, except for one thing, which is a note that you might have in your copy of the critique, or maybe not, because it's a note that Kant himself made in his first edition, and some editions of the critique have these notes and others do not. If yours has it, then at the very end of section 7, there's this little note that tells you that Kant notes in his copy of the first edition that in the first class of antinomical propositions, both are false, because they say more than is true, namely that there is an absolute totality of appearances. So it's false to say that the world is finite and that the world is infinite. It's false to say that matter can be divided infinitely, or that it's also false to say that it cannot be divided infinitely. However, in the second class, both can be true, Kant says. So, for instance, when it comes to the causal law and freedom, Kant is going to argue, he's going to tell us later, that maybe these things are both true. Everything is part of an infinite causal chain, and there are these causes that are sort of true beginnings, that are freedom in action, transcendental freedom. But we'll hear about that later. So, that was what, according to Gardner, is one of the most beautiful stretches of argument in Kant's writing. I'm definitely partial to it myself, right? It's a very elegant, very deep dive into the presuppositions that underlie all these metaphysical debates that have, been had in philosophy for so long. And Kant presents to us a completely radical rethinking of what goes wrong in them. Thinking of the world as something that does not lie there, like as an entity in itself, independently of us, and therefore cannot even be thought about in the way that traditional metaphysics has assumed.